Less than 8% of people alive today have blue eyes, and for most of the 20th century, the assumption behind that number seemed obvious enough not to question. Blue eyes must have arisen in Northern Europe, somewhere in the cold, pale forests of Scandinavia or the Baltic, exactly where the trait is most common today. In 2018, researchers at the Natural History Museum in London sequenced the genome of a 10,000-year-old skeleton found in a cave in southwestern England, reconstructed his face using the genetic data recovered from his bones, and revealed something that broke that assumption apart entirely. Cheddar Man, one of the oldest nearly complete human skeletons ever found in Britain, had strikingly pale blue eyes set into a face with dark brown to black skin and tightly curled dark hair. A combination so far outside the expected picture of ancient Europe that the reconstruction made international headlines within days, forcing museums, textbooks, and casual assumptions about what ancient European was supposed to look like to quietly reconsider themselves almost overnight. Cheddar Man wasn't an anomaly, he was a clue, and the genetic trail that clue set off, once researchers followed it all the way back to its actual source, didn't end in Scandinavia at all. It reached across an entire continent, into mountains and deserts. Most people would never think to associate with blue eyes, revealing that this single, seemingly simple trait carries one of the most geographically surprising migration stories in all of human genetics. The foundational scientific study behind this entire story was published in March 2008 in the journal Human Genetics, led by Professor Hans Eyberg at the University of Copenhagen's Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine. After more than a decade of research, Eyberg's team examined DNA collected from blue-eyed individuals across multiple countries, including Denmark, Turkey, and Jordan, tracing the genetic source of blue eye color to a single, remarkably specific mutation. A change at one particular position, a single nucleotide polymorphism labeled RS1913832, located within an intron of a gene called SHE-RC2 on chromosome 15. This location doesn't code for any protein itself, but it functions as a regulatory switch, controlling the activity of a neighboring gene, OCA2, which is directly responsible for melanin production within the iris. The team confirmed this mechanism directly in laboratory experiments, demonstrating that the mutated version of this regulatory sequence measurably reduced the activity of the OCA2 promoter in cultured cells compared to the ancestral unmutated version, establishing not just a statistical correlation, but an actual confirmed biological cause. What made Eyberg's finding so significant wasn't simply identifying which gene was involved. It was discovering that every blue-eyed person tested, regardless of which country they came from, carried not just the same mutation, but the exact same surrounding genetic sequence, the same haplotype, passed down as a single unbroken unit across thousands of years and multiple modern nationalities. In population genetics, that pattern has a very specific meaning. It's the signature of a founder effect, meaning the mutation did not arise independently, multiple times, in different populations. It arose exactly once, in one single human being, at one specific point in time, and every blue-eyed person alive today descends from that same original individual. Based on the rate of genetic mutation accumulation surrounding that founding event, Eyberg's team estimated the mutation first appeared somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. To understand why that single estimate would go on to upend assumptions about where this trait actually originated and where it eventually traveled, you first need to understand exactly what blue eyes are at the physical level and why they were never simply a matter of less pigment equals blue. It also helps to understand just how unusual this level of genetic uniformity actually is across such a large and geographically dispersed modern population. Most common human traits that vary across populations, from height to skin tone to disease resistance, involve dozens or even hundreds of genetic variants working in combination, each contributing a small partial effect, with different populations often arriving at similar outward traits through somewhat different underlying genetic roots. Blue eyes, by contrast, trace back to one identifiable genetic switch, inherited as a single package, which is precisely what allowed Eiberg's team to draw such a confident conclusion about a single common ancestor in the first place. Blue eyes are not, in any literal chemical sense, blue at all. There is no blue pigment present anywhere in a blue iris. What actually produces the color is a physical phenomenon called Tyndall scattering, the same basic principle responsible for the color of the sky. When an iris contains very little melanin, light passing through it scatters off the fine collagen fibers in the iris stroma and shorter wavelengths of light toward the blue end of the visible spectrum scatter more intensely than longer wavelengths. The result is the visual impression of blue produced entirely by physics acting on a low pigment tissue, not by any pigment actually manufacturing that color. The HERC-C2 mutation Eiberg's team identified works by partially suppressing OCA2 activity specifically within the iris, reducing melanin production enough to let this scattering effect dominate the eye's appearance, without affecting melanin production anywhere else in the body the way a more general genetic disruption might. Given that blue eyes are essentially a story about missing pigment, and given that the trait is overwhelmingly concentrated in northern European populations today, with countries including Estonia, Finland, and Ireland showing rates well above half their population, the natural assumption for decades was that the mutation itself must have originated somewhere in that same region, in the cold, dim environment of the European North, where scientists once speculated reduced sunlight might have created some selective advantage for lighter features generally, perhaps by improving vitamin D synthesis in a climate with fewer hours of usable sunlight across the year. It was a tidy, intuitive story. A trait common in the North today must have originated in the North long ago, gradually spreading and becoming concentrated exactly where it remains most common now, requiring no further explanation once you accepted that basic premise. The problem with that assumption became clear the moment researchers started sequencing ancient DNA directly from prehistoric skeletons, rather than reasoning backward from modern population frequencies alone. The earliest human remains found to carry the specific HERC-C2 mutation Eiberg identified did not come from Scandinavia, Ireland, or anywhere in Western Europe traditionally associated with blue eyes today. They came from a region most people would never have guessed, the grasslands stretching from modern Ukraine across southern Russia toward the Caucasus Mountains. A broad steppe zone geneticists call the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and the people who carried this mutation there looked nothing like what the Northern European origin assumption would have predicted, a mismatch stark enough that it forced researchers to reconsider not just where the mutation began, but what its earliest carriers actually looked like. In 2014, a research team led by Carles Lalueza-Fox sequenced the genome of a roughly 7,000-year-old hunter-gatherer skeleton recovered from the Logroño cave site in northern Spain, one of the best-preserved Mesolithic genomes ever recovered from European soil. The genetic markers extracted from that skeleton predicted, with strong statistical confidence, a combination that startled the research team at the time. Light-colored, likely blue eyes, paired with dark, deeply pigmented skin, nearly the exact opposite of the assumption, widely held even among specialists at the time, that light skin and light eyes had evolved together as a single genetic package somewhere in ancient Europe, spreading north in lockstep as populations adapted to the region's lower sunlight levels. The 2018 Cheddar Man reconstruction, produced by a research team including Johan Diekman and Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London, confirmed that the Lobrania individual was no isolated anomaly. Cheddar Man, dated to roughly 10,000 years ago and recovered from Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, carried the same genetic markers predicting blue eyes alongside dark brown to black skin and dark, tightly curled hair. A subsequent, larger 2015 study, led by Ian Matheson, analyzing selection pressure across dozens of ancient European genomes, confirmed that this combination wasn't unusual for the period at all, but represented the genuine norm across the continent at that time. Western European hunter-gatherer populations, the indigenous foraging communities who inhabited Europe for thousands of years before farming, arrived from the Near East, overwhelmingly carried the genetic markers for light eyes, including the specific high RC2 variant Iberg's team had identified, while simultaneously carrying genetic markers associated with notably darker skin than most modern Europeans display today. Light skin, the same research demonstrated, spread across Europe considerably later through an entirely separate set of genetic variants, introduced largely by Neolithic farming populations migrating in from Anatolia and the Near East, beginning around 8,000 years ago, meaning the two traits most people today assume arrived together as a package, pale skin and light eyes, actually followed two entirely separate genetic timelines, arriving from different directions carried by different populations, thousands of years apart. This picture already complicated the old assumption considerably. The first known carriers of blue eyes in the historical record weren't the pale blonde ancestors of modern Scandinavians at all. They were dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, and the genetic and archaeological trail connecting their ancestry back toward its ultimate point of origin pointed steadily eastward toward the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and the populations who would go on to be identified in later genetic research as ancient North Eurasians, and later still, the Yamnaya pastoralist culture that expanded explosively across Eurasia, beginning around 5,000 years ago. But the story doesn't end with Europe, and this is where the genetic trail takes its most unexpected turn, one that most popular accounts of blue eyes never mention at all. The descendants of the populations carrying this ancient mutation didn't only move west into Europe. Related ancestry, tracing back to the same deep, ancient North Eurasian source population, also reached considerably further east, into Central Asia and the mountainous corridor where modern Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and western China meet. Populations including the Pamiri communities of the high Pamir Mountains, the Kalash people of the Hindu Kush in northern Pakistan, and various communities across the Tarim Basin in what is now China's Xinjiang region, carry genuine documented ancestry connecting back to this same deep Eurasian source, and light eye color, including blue eyes, appears among these populations at rates far higher than chance contact with modern outsiders could ever explain. The most scientifically important test of exactly how this Eastern ancestry actually arrived came from the Tarim Basin mummies themselves. A set of remarkably preserved Bronze Age remains recovered from the Taklamakan Desert in western China, some dating back roughly 4,000 years, whose light hair and preserved features had fueled decades of speculation, dating back nearly a century to their initial discovery that they represented direct migrants from the West, bringing farming technology and Western Eurasian genetics into the heart of Inner Asia. When their full genomes were finally sequenced and published in the journal Nature in October 2021 by a research team led by Fan Zhang and Chao Ning, working with an international collaboration including Johannes Kraus and Christina Wariner, the results overturned nearly every existing theory about who these people actually were, including the theory the popular imagination had long since settled on. Rather than confirming that the Tarim mummies were recent migrants from Yamnaya-related steppe populations carrying blue eyes eastward as living evidence of a westward to eastward population sweep, The genome-wide data revealed something more specific and, in its own way, more remarkable. These individuals derived roughly 72% of their ancestry from the same deep ancient North Eurasian source population that also contributed to Yamnaya ancestry in Europe, combined with roughly 28% ancient Northeast Asian ancestry, but showed no detectable Western steppe-related Yamnaya-specific ancestry at all. In other words, the Tarim Basin population wasn't a branch of Yamnaya migrants who had traveled east, carrying steppe genetics with them. They were a genetically isolated, deeply local population, descended in parallel from the same ancient ancestral wellspring, who had adopted certain neighboring agricultural and pastoral practices, including dairy consumption and wheat cultivation, through cultural contact and trade rather than through large-scale intermarriage or population replacement. As the study's authors and outside commentators noted at the time of publication, this finding dispelled the long-standing popular notion that the mummies represented Western migrants bringing technology into the region from outside, revealing instead a story of deep genetic continuity in place, layered with cultural exchange rather than population replacement. A genuinely more interesting and more precise answer than the simpler migration story it replaced. This same ancient ancestral thread, the deep ancient North Eurasian lineage first identified through ancient genomes recovered near Lake Baikal in Siberia, turns out to be the common route connecting an extraordinarily wide and geographically scattered set of populations who would otherwise seem to have nothing to do with one another. The Yamnaya pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, who domesticated the horse and the wheeled cart and expanded explosively across Eurasia, beginning around 5,000 years ago, carrying this ancestry deep into Europe, the Indian subcontinent, and parts of Central Asia, the Tarim Basin populations of Western China, who carried a parallel, independently persisting branch of that same deep ancestry without direct steppe admixture. The Kalash people of the Hindu Kush, a small population numbering only a few thousand today, whose light eyes and hair reflect ancient Indo-Iranian migrations dating back roughly 4,000 years, considerably predating the popular but genetically unsupported folklore connecting them to the soldiers of Alexander the Great, a legend the actual genetic evidence simply does not support. And the Tocharians, a genuinely puzzling ancient people who lived in the Tarim Basin from roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era into the early medieval period, whose surviving manuscripts, written on birch bark and palm leaves and only fully deciphered in the early 20th century, turned out to preserve an Indo-European language more closely related to Celtic and Italic languages than to any of their immediate geographic neighbors. A linguistic puzzle, how a language from the western branch of the Indo-European family ended up spoken thousands of kilometers away at the edge of China. That ancient DNA research connected directly back to the same steppe-related migrations responsible for spreading blue eyes westward into Europe. Why the original mutation spread and persisted at all, given that blue eyes provide no obvious survival advantage against disease or climate, remains a genuinely open question among researchers. Some have proposed that the trait carried a degree of novelty-driven sexual selection within the small, relatively isolated populations of early post-Ice Age Eurasia, where a visibly distinct eye color might have made an individual more noticeable and therefore more memorable as a potential mate within a small community. Others suggest the mutation may have simply been linked through genetic proximity on the chromosome to other traits that were themselves under active selection, with eye color spreading as an incidental passenger rather than the actual target of selection pressure. Still others favor a simpler explanation entirely: ordinary genetic drift, in which a harmless, non-disadvantageous trait spreads through a population expanding rapidly during the early agricultural period, with no active selection pressure involved at all, simply carried along by the sheer demographic success of the populations who happen to carry it. What researchers can say with confidence, regardless of which explanation eventually proves correct, is the outcome. Once the mutation appeared in that single founding individual, it did not disappear, and the demographic explosion of the population carrying it, particularly through the Yamnaya expansion, ensured it was carried into an extraordinarily wide range of descendant populations across 2 continents. The modern geographic distribution of blue eyes, once you understand this deeper history, stops looking like a story of independent regional origins and starts looking like a map of population expansion and subsequent isolation. Blue eyes reach their highest frequencies today in Estonia and Finland, where surveys have found the trait present in well over half the population, with similarly high concentrations across Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Ireland. This concentration reflects not an independent regional origin, but the specific demographic history of these populations. Relatively small, genetically isolated communities in which a trait that arrived through earlier step-related migration had centuries to become concentrated through generations of local intermarriage, undiluted by the kind of continuous, large-scale immigration that would have introduced other eye-color variants into the population at a faster rate. In much larger, more continuously mixed populations elsewhere across Eurasia, the same ancestral trait persists, but at lower, more scattered frequencies, precisely the pattern researchers would expect from a single ancient founder mutation carried outward by expanding populations, rather than a trait that separately and independently arose in multiple different regions to explain each area where it appears today. The physical mechanism behind the trait's genuinely rare origin also helps explain why it never independently re-evolved anywhere else, the way certain other traits sometimes do through what geneticists call convergent evolution. The specific single-letter change Iberg's team identified within the HERC2 regulatory region represents an extraordinarily narrow genetic target, a precise particular disruption to a regulatory switch controlling a neighboring gene, rather than a more general category of mutation that could plausibly arise through many different genetic pathways. The odds against that exact same change occurring independently by chance in a second, unrelated population somewhere else in the world are astronomically low, which is precisely why every blue-eyed person tested by Iberg's original study, and by every subsequent study conducted since, shares not just the mutation itself, but the identical surrounding genetic sequence inherited alongside it. For most of the last century, the story of blue eyes was told with a confidence the genetic evidence never actually supported. A northern European trait, born in the cold and the pale light of the continent's far north, spreading outward from there to everywhere else it's found today. The real story, pieced together across more than 15 years of research, from a single Danish genetics lab in the early 2000s through a Chinese desert excavation reanalyzed with cutting-edge sequencing technology in 2021, reveals something both stranger and more unifying than that original assumption ever allowed for. A single mutation arising in one specific person on the grasslands of Eurasia somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, carried first by dark-skinned hunter-gatherers who looked nothing like the ancestors modern Europeans imagined for themselves, and then spread by later population movements not just westward into the forests and fjords of Europe, but eastward as well, into the high deserts of western China and the mountain valleys of the Hindu Kush, along a route connecting populations that most people would never think to place on the same genetic map at all. If you carry blue eyes, the ancestor responsible for that trait was never simply European in any narrow sense the term is usually meant to convey. They were a member of a population whose genetic legacy stretches from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the deserts of western China, present in the DNA of Norwegian fishing communities and Tajik mountain villages alike. not because of any recent contact between these places, but because both trace back through thousands of years and thousands of generations to the same original human being. That single ancestor is, in the most literal sense population genetics can offer, a shared grandparent to every blue-eyed person alive today, no matter where on the map they happen to call home, whether that home is a fishing village on a Norwegian fjord or a high mountain settlement in the Pamirs. There's a quiet, easily overlooked detail buried in this story worth pausing on. The two traits most people assume must have arrived together as a single package, pale skin and light eyes, turn out to have entirely separate origins, arriving from different directions carried by different populations, thousands of years apart from one another. Cheddar Man's reconstructed face, dark-skinned and blue-eyed at once, isn't simply a striking image. It's a direct physical rebuttal to an assumption about ancient Europe that had gone essentially unquestioned for generations, replaced only once ancient DNA finally gave researchers a way to test it directly rather than infer it backward from how modern populations happen to look today. It's worth remembering, too, that this rebuttal wasn't limited to a single skeleton in a single English cave. La Braña Man in Spain, dated even earlier than Cheddar Man, carried the same unexpected combination, and the broader 2015 survey of dozens of hunter-gatherer genomes across the continent confirmed it as the genuine norm for the period, not a one-off curiosity easily dismissed as an outlier. If a trait this visible, this common, and this confidently explained by a simple regional origin story could turn out to hold this much unexpected geography once ancient DNA was finally sequenced and read carefully, it raises a question worth sitting with. How many other traits we assume we already understand, features we've stopped even thinking to question because the explanation feels so obvious, are still waiting for the right ancient genome to reveal how much further their story actually reaches, connecting people and places that, on the surface, seem to have absolutely nothing to do with one another.